It's here, in a tiny settlement, high in the Andes mountain range of South America, that global trade begins. And that's because of what is discovered deep inside this mountain. The purest silver the world has ever seen. It's 1581, and a buyer appears for this silver. 11,000 miles away, the Emperor of China, the most powerful man on earth, has decided that his people must now pay their tax in silver.
This sparks a huge demand for silver in China, to the point where silver was worth more than gold.
This series explores how the world is transformed when the King of Spain's silver meets the tax demands of the Emperor of China. It's a remarkable story that witnesses how China came to dominate at the dawn of world trade over 400 years ago.
The first time the whole world was linked into one global network, and the most important element of this is silver.
Silver allows China's emperors to become the most powerful men on earth, and silver makes this businessman the richest man in the world.
A lot of America's Industrial Revolution was funded by this Chinese merchant.
Chinese craftsmen go on to create silverware of unparalleled skill and beauty that are coveted across the world.
Already in the 18th century, people were admiring this fantastic work because the wire is so thin, it's like hair.
China's silver trade drives the growth of world cities from Boston to Hong Kong, Shanghai to Seville. But it also sows the seeds of China's near destruction and leads to war with Western powers.
The British were determined to get a war. They got the war.
It's the time when China enters what's become nicknamed the Century of Humiliation, the period when China was not in control of its own external affairs.
But China won't let go its obsession with this precious metal.
Only trust silver. It is almost like a religion in Chinese history. Silver is our gold in Chinese history.
This series reveals how silver changes China's history and the history of the world.
It's like holding a piece of history on your hand.
How China and silver will affect the rest of the world can be seen perhaps for the first time in July 1588, in one of the most dramatic moments in the history of Europe. On the north coast of Spain, King Philip II, protector of the Catholic faith, has gathered a mighty armada, 130 ships and 30,000 men, the vanguard of a holy war he's waging across Europe and Asia. Elizabeth I, Queen of England and ruler of the most powerful Protestant country in Europe, knows she is his target. If Philip II succeeds, he will overthrow her and make England Catholic again. But how can Philip put together such an armada? How can he afford it? The surprising answer is a decision made thousands of miles from Spain by another ruler, not about power or religion, but about tax. In 1581, 7 years before Philip unleashes his armada, the Emperor of China commands that his people must pay all their taxes in silver. Spain is the one country that can fully satisfy China's huge hunger for silver.
The silver trade between Spain and China, we tend to think of European trade, particularly trade in bullion, as being something that Europe develops, that Europe pushes for, that Europe is the impetus behind. It's actually China.
What we explore in this revelatory series is how through this one decision, a Ming emperor placed China at the heart of world trade. Globalization isn't a creation of the 21st century. China made it happen over 400 years ago. It is the 16th century in China, Within the walls of the Forbidden City, the largest palace complex in the world, the emperors of the Ming dynasty rule over a quarter of the world's population. Since the travels of Marco Polo in the 13th century, the rest of the world has been dazzled by the scale and sophistication of China.
Beijing was impressive. Large city, beautiful buildings, tight control of the emperor. So visitors to China of Ming Dynasty were very impressed. Oh, this country is much more advanced than Western Europe.
And the Chinese think of themselves as the center of civilization, perfectly captured in a unique artifact. This is one of the most famous maps in history. It's called a map of the myriad countries of the world. It was drawn at the request of the Chinese emperor. At the very center, the mapmaker placed China, the hub of the world around which everything revolves. China, the Middle Kingdom.
Ming Dynasty China, in terms of territory, was a very much larger country than national states that were coming up in Europe. The emperor was much more wealthy than the richest kings in Europe. They were never shaken to believe that China was the center of the world.
But Ming emperors do have one weakness. Their power is built on sand. They are hamstrung by a tax system of extraordinary inefficiency and complexity.
The government was actually founded on people performing service as a kind of taxation and delivery of taxes in kind. So you had to pay so much in terms of rice or silk or cotton. In the Ming Dynasty, they were master tax dodgers.
It used to be that the emperor would require peasants to turn in certain amount of grain to pay as tax, or certain amount of meat as taxation, right? But that's very difficult to implement because it's hard to ship. Second, it's hard to measure the quality of grain, right? It's much better and much more flexible just to pay money.
But the government has been issuing paper money on and off since the 11th century, but the people have little trust in its value.
As we know historically, when the emperor or the authority begins to issue paper money, the temptation to issue a lot of paper money is too hard to resist. So when everybody has paper money, right, it becomes worthless. People in Chinese history have deep rooted idea that only trust metal.
So in China of the 1500s, it is the humble copper coin which remains the most reliable currency. But it has a major drawback: its weight.
This is called 1 Ming. It is 100 coins. And 10 of the 100, which is 1,000, is called guan. You think about if you put a lot of coins in your pockets, it will be very heavy and not easy to handle them. So you can try to buy something which costs 1,000 coins, or maybe you can take only 1/3 of the silver.
So for good reason, the Chinese people begin to make larger payments in silver, far lighter and more valuable than copper. This change in society does not go unnoticed by one of the most influential politicians in Chinese history. His name is Zhang Zhuzhang.
那么，但是呢，他在很年轻的时候，他对这个当时的中国的这样一个变化就很了解，所以当时就找到了，就是现在我们中国，发生了很多的变化，但是我们现在的制度有很多方面不适应这样一种变化。
By the 1570s, Zhang Zhuzhang is the senior Grand Secretary to the Emperor.
So you can imagine how powerful the person was. So this guy was in control of whole China, running day-to-day operations. He quickly realized that without taxation, without enough financial resources, the country cannot run.
So in response to the people's choice to use silver, in 1580, Zhang Zhuzheng boldly alters the tax system. The single whip reform will forever alter the course of Chinese history.
What is meant by the single whip is to collapse all of these different kinds of labor services into one silver payment. In silver, it's much easier for the government to collect a fixed amount of silver from everyone rather than going around and saying, you must go and do this job, and you must go and do this kind of work, and so forth.
And it works. At the National Museum of China in Beijing, one artifact shows how the most powerful government on earth is no longer financed by complex and inefficient exchanges of wheat, rice, and labor, but by simple payments in silver.
这一块银锭呢，是50两的一个银锭，它特别让我们感到兴奋的是，它上面刻了非常多的字，这告诉我们明代赋税啊、货币使用啊很多的信息，所以它特别让我们兴奋。
Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything, from the wonders of ancient Pompeii and the mystery of the princes in the tower to the life of Anne Boleyn and D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description.
前面广东广州府顺德县是这个银锭铸造和它解运的起点。接下来我们看到他说是解经银，意味着这块银锭不是留在顺德县当地作为地方的经费使用，而是要运到北京去交给中央的。接下来我们看到说折米200石。 这一句话非常的精彩，因为我们知道明代的赋税的征收经历了从实物到货币的一个转变。这时候我们注意到官府在记载财政收支的时候，已经把银作为一个最重要的数字来记载，而把米放在后面。
But with a population well over 100 million people now taxed in silver, China requires unprecedented amounts of this metal. With little silver of its own, China must look to the outside world for silver.
What the single whip reform does is it forces China to be essentially at the mercy of foreign trade. They are essentially forced to import silver. This increases their trade with Japan. Japanese silver reserves were fairly quickly, not necessarily exhausted, but Japan was unable to meet China's demand.
This single whip reform could look like a massive miscalculation by the Chinese emperor. Were it not for an amazing discovery 36 years before and thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean in one of the remotest corners of the rapidly expanding Spanish Empire. This is Potosi, 4,000 meters above sea level in what was then Peru. Today, 250,000 people live and work here. But in the early 1500s, there are just a few farmers grazing their llamas. One lost llama in the mountain leads to an astonishing discovery, a discovery that will make this corner of the New World a jewel in the crown of the Spanish Empire.
La historia mitológica, la historia romántica, dice que Diego Hualpa, que era una persona natural de estos lugares, se encontraba caminando por el Cerro Rico de Potosí apacentando su rebaño. Pero ¿qué pasó? Se le perdió una de sus llamas y él tuvo que quedarse perdido en el cerro. Recurrió a la vieja práctica de hacer una fogata para mantener el calor corporal y gran fue su sorpresa. Al día siguiente la fogata organizó hilos de plata que empezaron a correr a lo largo de toda la montaña.
The Spanish give the mountain the name by which it is still known today. Cerro Rico, rich mountain, a mountain of the purest silver the world has ever seen.
In the 16th and 17th century, at least at certain times, it's estimated that 50% of all the silver produced in the world was coming out of Upper Peru, Potosi. It's amazing. So the Spaniards were very fortunate to discover the richest silver mines in the history of the world, and also in Mexico. but the big one was Potosi.
The Potosi discovery unleashes a silver rush, its impact global and local.
Cuando arranca la explotación en el Cerro Rico, no tenía iglesias, no tenía palacios, no tenía plazas, solamente era una yuxtaposición de diferentes caseríos.
The population in 1545 was roughly 0, and 60 years later it was 160,000. So it was really a mind-boggling, probably the greatest boom city in the history of the world.
But even with this population explosion, the Spanish face a problem all across their empire in the New World. Where to get the manpower to extract the silver.
You've got these vast continents with huge resources, but you have no labor supply, or at least a very depleted labor supply. So what are you going to do?
In order to get the silver, the Spanish enslaved the indigenous people of the New World. One mine boss said, if 20 healthy Indians enter on a Monday, half may emerge, crippled by Saturday. When the Indian population is decimated by European diseases and warfare, the Spanish then turn to slaves from Africa.
Estos esclavos eran muy codiciados en Potosí, y ciertamente Potosí puede ser la ciudad que más cantidad de esclavos negros ha tenido por su enorme aparato industrial.
This mine, it was called by many of the people who worked it as the mountain that eats men. And it's an illustration of the terrible human cost, the very real cost in blood, in lives of this silver trade.
Even today, it is a dangerous place to work.
La vida del minero aquí es complicado, ¿no? Porque nosotros como mineros aquí estamos a riesgo de los gases, estamos a riesgo de los peligros que corremos interior mina. Y entonces a causa de eso a la larga viene la enfermedad de la mina. Hay mineral aquí, ¿no? El problema es que de los riesgos que corremos, ¿no? Ya como más antes se ha informado que ha habido 2 compañeros que han estado atrapados, me parece que ni siquiera van a rescatar, entonces.
Over the centuries, millions of African and indigenous people die extracting New World silver. In the words of one writer, you could build a bridge from Potosi to Madrid from what was mined here, and one back with the bones of those that died taking it out. But once the silver was mined, the Spanish still had to find a market for it. They find it 12,000 miles away, across the Pacific, in another part of the world they'd recently colonized and named in honor of Philip II, the Philippines. The Spanish established Manila as its capital.
When the Spanish arrived in this fantastic bay, one of the finest harbors in the world, they already found Chinese junks engaged in a low-level regional trade with the Philippines. And the Chinese will sail from the ports of Yangzhou and also from Canton, bringing their wares from farther inland in the factories in China, silk from Nanjing, porcelain from Jingdezhen. All these wares were exchanged in Manila.
Thousands more Chinese traders now sail to Manila with these luxury goods to sell to the Spanish. And when they return home to China, their ships are laden with one precious commodity.
Already in 1570, the Viceroy of New Spain in Mexico, Don Martín Enriquez, wrote to the king, there is nothing we can export to China that they don't already have. And the only way to trade with the Chinese is silver. Silver is the only thing they want. Silver defines this trade, so much so that we can call this trade the silver way.
It's the silver pouring into China that's helping fuel the economic miracle in the Middle Kingdom.
China, that's the manufacturer of the world, dates from this time. They were manufacturing goods on spec for foreign buyers. These were things that were not made in China for Chinese use. They would be made for order for customers in Europe and Spanish America.
Driven by China's need for silver, the early global economy is taking shape. In 1573, a mint opens in Potosi that produces a silver coin that is at the heart of this early trade, and one that becomes the first global currency, the 8 real Spanish peso, better known as pieces of 8.
La moneda española de 8 reales dinamizó por completo el concepto de una economía global y es notablemente aceptada en todos los rincones del planeta. Y por supuesto, esta moneda llegó también a los confines más remotos del cristianismo, a las fronteras del Imperio Chino, a las fronteras de la India.
Global trade really started, in the 16th century. You can see the world to a certain degree was beginning to be connected as integrated whole. This is the first time the whole world was linked into one global network, and the most important element of this is silver.
Manila becomes one of the most important global hubs in this silver circuit. Between 1572 and 1580, the number of Chinese junks sailing to Manila laden with silk and porcelain jumps by over 1,000%. To accommodate this increase in trade, the Spanish need to build boats on a scale and durability never attempted before.
These were, of course, wooden sailing ships, built here in the Philippines for the most part, of tropical hardwoods. They were almost indestructible. They were impervious to ship rot and even cannonballs to a very large extent. And they were huge. They were up to 2,000 tons at a time when a typical ship was 200 tons. So these were what we call today container ships, the largest ships in the world at the time.
These ships become known as the Manila galleons. Twice a year, weighed down with New World silver, they sail nearly 9,000 miles from Acapulco to Manila.
Manila is actually the center of a global trade that is immensely profitable on not only both sides of the Pacific, but on both sides of the Atlantic as well.
Thanks to the silver China demands, Spain can now command a colossal empire. A Franciscan monk is moved to describe it to the King of Spain as an empire on which the sun never sets. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain experiences a golden age of high culture and grand architecture. But it also provides Spain with the financial might to wage perpetual war and turn Europe into a battlefield.
It's a country of 6 million people going to become the dominant military power, fighting the British, the Armada, or the endless fighting against the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, and also fighting the Dutch endlessly in Asian waters for control. I mean, how is a small country without an industrial revolution, agricultural revolution, going to pay for this? Well, silver mines, thanks to China.
In Manila, the opportunities of the silver trade gives rise to something new. A phenomenon that has been repeated in almost all of the great trading cities of the world ever since.
Welcome to Binondo, Manila's Chinatown. This is supposedly the oldest Chinatown in the world. When Spain settled in Manila in the late 1500s, the Chinese followed suit. They became the traders and the middlemen, and also the skilled craftsmen for the Spanish colonial government.
Trade in Manila brings fantastic profits, but it also brings suspicion and fear. There is distrust and hostility between the Chinese and Spanish for one specific reason.
In the beginning, the Spanish hoped to use Manila as a springboard to potentially invade and conquer China. The idea was that they could do this using the same model they had used to conquer Mexico. After the Spanish realized that conquering China was not going to happen, they began to focus on Manila as a trade center. The relationship between the Spanish and the Chinese in Manila was extremely tense.
In the early 1600s, the Chinese population in Manila massively outnumbers the Spanish. In a city that forms a crucial part of their empire, the Spanish start to behave as if they are under siege.
In most early modern cities, fortifications like cannons, primitive artillery, these sorts of things are pointed outward. As time went on in Manila, these weapons began to be pointed inwards, so this is a situation that could at any moment escalate into violence.
So this is intramuros. Intramuros literally means inside the walls. And these are the walls. These are the walls we're walking on. The Spanish part of the city was on this side of the walls. This is inside, and this is outside here. There were never more than a few thousand Spanish here at any one time. There were many, many more, for example, Chinese who lived on the other side of the wall, sometimes up to tens of thousands of them.
There was always a love-hate relationship between the Chinese and the Spanish. When there's too many of the Chinese in the country, the Spanish would restrict immigration, deport the Chinese en masse, or even massacre them.
In 1603, the tensions erupt into a rebellion by the Chinese against the Spanish.
This is a rebellion that went on for multiple days. There are multiple verifiable reports of the severed heads of both Chinese and Spanish being displayed throughout Manila on pikes, held in people's hands, essentially to intimidate. And when it was over 20,000 people had been killed.
Despite the carnage in Manila, the Chinese population never dwindles for long. The financial pull of the Manila trade is too powerful.
They're never able to fully expel the Chinese or even come close to it because of not only the numerical difference, but because of the vital role the Chinese play in this silver trade and how economically dependent both Spain and China had become on this trade.
For more than 50 years, silver flowing into China sees the Ming dynasty prosper. But in the early decades of the 17th century, silver will become a major factor in the downfall of the Ming. Military campaigns are draining China's silver reserves. The government cannot collect enough tax from its suffering people, and China's economy is now precariously yoked to silver from the mines of the New World.
The amount of silver required to sustain this economy from the Spanish alone averages about 50 tons a year throughout the 17th century.
When that supply is interrupted, Chinese emperors face an immediate problem.
In the late 1630s, several galleons sank, one after another. It meant that the flow of silver stopped for a while.
This was the first time when financial activities in one part of the world had a global reach, had a global effect. So when, for example, one of these ships would sink on the way to Manila and the silver would go down with the ship, it would have what we would now call a money supply shock in China.
流入中国的白银数量有所减少，这其实使得整个明朝的那个官方的那个税收受到很大的影响。
Silver had created an economic revolution in China, but now its scarcity causes catastrophe. Emperor Chongzhen doesn't have the money to bankroll his troops, and his country is threatened by rebels and enemies to the north.
所以最后在西部在边疆的官兵其实是5个月都没有领到那个以白银计算的官饷了。而我们知道那个李自成所在的西北其实是一个没有被白银浸润的地区。
And that, of course, is creating all kinds of discontent. Not being able to pay the soldiers has huge damaging impact on the morale and the possible rebellion.
The consequences for the Ming Empire are devastating. In 1644, after 276 years of Ming rule, Beijing falls to a rebel army. Disgraced and in despair, Emperor Chongzhen walks to a small hill overlooking the Forbidden City and hangs himself. The man whose empire is tied to silver is undone for the lack of it. A new dynasty, the Qing, takes control of China. They are fearsome warriors from the north, where there is a long tradition of fine horsemanship and hunting. For 40 years, the Qing put down resistance to their rule. Only after then can the new emperor, Kangxi, devote time to what role China will play in the wider world.
康熙8年以后，亲政以后呢，那么逐渐的到他成人以后，就慢慢的在我们所在的这个乾清门的地方呢，来御门听政。在这个地方，经历了很多非常重要的事。
For the last 40 years, all maritime trade has been blocked. Now Kangxi's empire is secure. He has a decision to make. Should he maintain the ban or open China to maritime trade? In 1684, Kangxi issues an edict to his people. I command you to go abroad and trade to show the populous and affluent nature of our rule. By imperial decree, I open the seas to trade. With China's coast now open, a vigorous trade develops, and the flow of silver resumes. Kangxi sets up custom houses at 4 major ports. Custom silver flows directly into his personal coffers. A period of peace and prosperity begins, unparalleled in Chinese history.
这些海关建立以后，当然同时，由于海外贸易的扩展，从海关进来的白银就也在增加，因为收的是海关的关税嘛。
This is where Kangxi's edict has the greatest impact. Guangzhou, also known as Canton. Today, 10 miles east of Canton, vast container ships dock here at its port of Whampoa, round the clock, 365 days a year. Its location has made it one of the busiest waterways in the world. In the wake of Kangxi's edict, foreign ships laden with silver make their way to Canton up the estuary of the Pearl River.
佢必須要喺呢個位置，甚至較前嘅位置咧，係停下來，然後咧佢哋係換一個普通嘅商船，然將佢啲貨放喺普通嘅商船嗰度，然後先可以繼續航行。然後咧佢哋咧就會向前行啦。然後向行到某個景點嘅時候，某個地點嘅時候咧，就會有一個地方叫黃埔。佢哋喺我度咧，皇帝咧喺黃埔咧，喺整咗個關，即係個海關。佢哋喺黃埔咧要 交去報佢哋帶嘅貨啦，然後咧就要交稅。
The leading maritime powers of the world all come to Canton. British, Dutch, French, Danish and Swedish merchants all set up shop in this Chinese port.
So this is an incredibly elaborate set of 18 panels of Chinese export wallpaper with many different scenes of daily life in Guangzhou. We see small shops that are selling local fare. We see craftsmen creating things, people at leisure. You can see the bustle of commerce on the river, and indeed there are views of the river where you can virtually not see the water. There are so many of these small sampan boats in which many Chinese were living as well as transporting.
This trade is only good news for China, who levy tax on the goods and silver arriving in Canton.
我们现在身处的这里呢，就是一个税馆内的情景。这两位呢，就是税官，他们在清点扩银，而他们身前的天皮呢，就是用来称量各个国家不同银元的一个重量以及纯度的。而他们身后墙上高挂着这些国旗呢，就是代表着这些国家都与我们中国有贸易往来的关系。白银的一个用天平的过程呢，可以看到其实也是没有太复杂的，因为白银呢是可以融化的嘛，所以呢我们也可以把外国人所使用的一些银元来熔掉，制成我们中国所用的一个白银。
The merchants come to buy silks and ceramics, but in the 1700s, demand grows enormously for a product that only the Chinese produce. One that they've treasured for thousands of years. It's a drink that will change the world.
China had tea. Nowhere else in the world, as it was known at the time, produced tea. Tea takes hold quite rapidly. It's an addictive drug. Attempts to find and export seeds of tea plants covertly generally failed because the Qing Empire refused to allow foreigners to enter the interior of the country. They could only deal with traders at the points of entry.
These tea terraces are in Guizhou, in southwestern China, known locally as the Sea of Tea. Today, tea exports from the area bring in millions of dollars. 250 years ago, the trade is just beginning to take off.
在18世纪的时候，外国人开始喝中国茶。欧洲人喝茶，应该说最显著的就是英国人。英国人是最爱喝茶的，而且英国人最早喝的是，英国人我们今天都知道最爱喝的是红茶。
In the 17th century, it's Catherine of Braganza, wife of Charles II, who makes tea popular in the royal court in London. And where the royals lead, the rest of the nation follows. The more demand grows, the more China benefits, and it's a trade that guarantees return business.
Tea, the caffeine itself, that you and I are addicted to, that caused the return, that resulted in the return of traders from the Western world to China, to Canton, asking for more year after year.
The tea trade becomes one of the largest trades in the world. The holds of merchant ships are packed with tea crates. But it also travels overland to another great empire on China's northern border, Russia.
俄罗斯人开始喝茶，大概是在17也是开始从17世纪到18世纪的时候比较多，跟西欧是差不多是同步的。那么他们总共是通过一条叫陆上茶叶之路，或者我们今天把它叫做万里茶道，进口中国的茶叶。
Caravans of camels make the long and dangerous journey along the tea road, which stretches over 2,000 miles from the plantations of eastern China across the vast Mongolian steppes and ends in the great Russian city of St. Petersburg. It's an exchange of Chinese luxury goods and tea for Russian furs and, of course, silver. The wealth generated from the tea trade helps build the monumental architecture of St. Petersburg, the fabulously elegant city of Russia's imperial czars.
This trade was very important, not only because it brought taxes to Russian state, but because of this trade, new generation of merchants have appeared in Russia, and they were eager to invest their fortunes in different spheres of life. So a lot of spheres of the Russian life, economic and cultural, were flourishing due to the money that were initially gained by the trade, by the tea trade.
Like oil in the 20th century, tea becomes one of the most valuable traded commodities throughout the 18th century world. It generates huge revenues, and the wealth has a transformative effect across China. By the middle of the 18th century, China's population has doubled and is on its way to tripling, an increase virtually unprecedented in the history of the modern world. China's growing population needs to be housed, and its wealthy emperors want ever more lavish palaces. So the demand for timber increases massively. Buying the wood in ever greater volume forces merchants to travel deeper and deeper into China's interior. Many come here to the densely forested hills of southeast Guizhou to trade with one previously self-reliant community called the Miao.
在贵州的这些苗人呢，他们其实对外部世界的商品的需求是很小的，因为在贵州是一个自然资源非常丰富的地方，所以他们基本上没有任何的需求对外部世界，除了盐以外。这样的话，他大量的木材的这个从他那里获取，用什么去换这些木材？那就要想有一个他们能接受的东西，那么这个就是白银啊，白银是他们最能够接受的一种东西。
This trade in timber for silver would not only boost the fortunes, but would profoundly alter the way of life of the Miao, one of China's most distinctive people. Having little use for silver as money, the Miao use this beautiful white metal to create fabulous and intricate jewelry. Silver becomes a symbol for wealth and status. Miao silver art endures today in an unbroken line of unique craftsmanship.
我想去孝敬我的祖先，我想去怀念我的祖父，怀念我的祖祖父，或者怀念我的父亲，或者怎么样。我首先那就把他这门手艺延续做下去。我为什么说我要坚持去做这个？因为在苗族的很多传统东西不断的丢失的过程中。 苗族是穿在身上的民族，所以说白银对苗族来说特别的重要。我们在逢年过节，我们要穿着我们的银饰，戴着我们的银，戴着我们的就比如戴我们的这些银帽、银项圈。
结婚的时候，一生中最大的、最幸福的那一刻就穿纯银的，祖上传下来的那套。 像这个项圈的话呢，它也是代表着，因为这个银饰的话，大家越多的话，就显示你越富有。 就是我外婆留给我妈妈的，然后我妈妈又传给我的，以后我又传给我女儿。
Less than 200 years after China demands that its people pay their tax in silver, China has been transformed. Increased wealth and unstoppable foreign trade has also created a more material mindset in China.
Now, people are more focused on only make money, right? Make money. Don't worry about what you actually do, right? So they change the mentality of people, making people more oriented towards commercial life.
Trade is bringing in silver, but it also heralds the arrival of ambitious foreigners who are becoming a permanent feature in the daily life of the coastal ports of China. And by the middle of the 18th century, that, for the young Emperor Qianlong, is becoming a greater and greater problem. European merchants trigger a constant stream of trade disputes and complaints. Their sailors are quarrelsome, rowdy, and drunk.
Western traders considered themselves gentlemen. They came from advanced, enlightened societies. Qing officials and others would increasingly come to regard them as uncouth barbarians.
In 1757, worried by the disputes and disorder, the Emperor Qianlong takes drastic action. With the exception of one port, Canton, the Chinese coast will no longer be open to Western trade.
清政府要控制洋商呢，是因为呢，他怕清政府那时候的一个政权的一个不稳定，所以呢，他就怕一些外来的一个威胁，所以呢，他就要控制洋商来保证他们的一个清政府的一个统治。
Emperor Qianlong can use the very river that brings the foreign ships to Canton to his advantage. The Pearl River is the only route into the city, and at the Boca Tigris, the mouth of the Tiger, where the river narrows, it is decreed that merchant ships can go no further. This keeps foreigners at arm's length, and previous restrictions are now enforced more strictly.
佢唔可以喺廣州咧，喺逗留過冬天嘅。佢需要喺冬天之前離開廣州。咁呢個對於個商人係好唔方便。
Those foreigners are confined to a small enclave outside Canton city walls, in residences known as factories.
What you're seeing here are the foreign factories in which all foreigners would have lived and worked from the late 18th century until really the first quarter of the 19th century. These look like Western-style buildings. They're fundamentally Chinese buildings with a Western facade. And the foreign merchants who were coming to Guangzhou would have both lived and worked in these spaces. So having come halfway around the world, this is literally all of China that you ever would have had an opportunity to see.
The restrictions on the life of foreigners may be stifling and monotonous. But what is becoming intolerable for Western merchants, in particular the British, is a restriction that could be curbing profits.
They start to believe that there is a coalition of interests based in Canton now, which has a grip of the Canton trade, which is going to prevent them getting to Chinese markets.
In Canton, all Western merchants must deal exclusively with a small select group of influential Chinese merchants called the Cohong. They are an official barrier to the potential riches of the Chinese interior.
If British traders can only get beyond Canton, they can sell to the 300 million residents of China.
Spearheading this discontent is the most significant foreign trading operation, not just in Canton, but across the world, the British East India Company. It is a company like no other, immensely rich and powerful, with a private army that would grow to number 200,000 men, it has the ability to act with the decisiveness and competence of a nation-state.
The East India Company was a monopoly that was frustrated by the monopolies of others. It had a monopoly on the trade with the Indies, but it objected to the fact that the Chinese controlled the terms of the trade in China. Its officials were always men on the make. Men keen to make the fortune that they could make in a very few successful trading systems and then get out of the East, get back to Britain, buy an estate, settle there.
One such man is James Flint, a junior officer of the East India Company. Fired by raw ambition, Flint takes it upon himself to contest the Chinese terms of trade on behalf of the British. In so doing, he sets a chain of events that lead to imprisonment and execution. In 1759, Flint goes on the offensive. He sails out of Canton to confront the Chinese emperor himself.
He sailed north to Tianjin with a petition which he was trying to send to the emperor to complain about the specific terms of trade, to complain about corruption at Canton. And this petition did in fact get to the emperor.
When Qianlun receives the petition, he at first orders an investigation and then changes his mind and metes out tough justice.
Quite a large number of officials at Canton lost their jobs. Two men who helped in the preparation of the petition lost their heads.
Having dealt with his Chinese subjects, Qianlun then takes action against Flint for his impudence. He imprisons him for 3 years and banishes him from the country forever.
James Flint was the first of a number of British officials and traders who tried to push the boundaries and change the rules of the game. This would happen again and again and again.
But at this moment, China sits unrivaled at the top of world trade. The Flint affair allows Qianlun to show the rest of the world that if it wants to trade with China, they must abide by his rules. In 1760, he issues his regulations against the barbarians, definitively spelling out all the restrictions on foreigners.
China essentially runs the world economy, and we tend not to think of it as Westerners because we operate on the assumption that major global currents are initiated by Europeans, when in fact China is very much the catalyst in all of this.
But China's global dominance is not restricted to trade. Its culture has taken hold of the world's imagination. The royal courts of Europe are obsessed with the idea of China itself. When Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, builds her famous Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, she also commissions the building of an entire village for visiting nobility. It is built in a fanciful and decorative Chinese style that becomes known as chinoiserie.
In the 18th century, China was very fashionable throughout Europe. Of course, this is more their fantasy. That's how China was imagined. You see these beautiful dragons there, the fish scale patterns on roofing, the curved roofs. Some people say that's a mockery, yeah, but I would say that's like a nice fairy tale, what they created here.
The Hermitage Museum is Catherine the Great's legacy to Russia. It houses one of the finest art collections in the world, bequeathed by Catherine on her death in 1796. Part of the Empress of Russia's vast collection contains an extraordinary work of Chinese silver. A 32-piece toilette set gifted to Catherine on her wedding in 1745.
Such fine lace filigree. It was, well, special of Chinese in the 18th century. And at the moment, I think now we can be sure that no one can imitate it, or it takes so much labor and, well, money that it's not possible to do that. Some of the details have Chinese symbolism, like these apples of pomegranate. So you can see that it's like a broken pomegranate with seeds. And that was the symbol of omnipotence. Have as many suns as seeds in this pomegranate. The wire is so thin, it's like hair. And you see that possibly this crab was used for lipstick or for rouge or for, well, for some cosmetics. This mirror is adorned with more than 400 diamonds. This mirror, you can see the shape is typically Chinese. It's decorated with dragons, Chinese dragons, and of course, well, you smile looking at it because they are all shiny and beautiful and again show the richness and the wealth of Russian court and of Catherine the Great.
As the 18th century draws to a close, China is at the height of its powers. It remains the Middle Kingdom, the axis of civilization and world trade. In 200 years, silver has led to an economic miracle, making China an even greater engine of global growth. The world is clamoring for its exquisite crafts and its tea, and the Middle Kingdom has never reigned over so much territory. The Qing dynasty appears to be invulnerable.
For most of human history, China has represented the world's foremost economic power.
But the challenge posed by James Flint heralds a new and ominous chapter in the fortunes of China. British merchants, fired by the rigid doctrine of free trade, grow even more frustrated in their dealings with China. But now they are backed by unparalleled firepower.
The British had taken a quantum leap in terms of the amount of violence they were able to inflict on those who ran up against them.
Because of silver, China has no choice but to confront this seismic force, and that will lead to war and national shame.
It marks the beginning of a period that shapes Chinese thinking even today, in the early 21st century. It's the time when China enters what's become nicknamed the century of humiliation.
It's here, in a tiny settlement, high in the Andes mountain range of South America, that global trade begins. And that's because of what is discovered deep inside this mountain. The purest silver the world has ever seen. It's 1581, and a buyer appears for this silver. 11,000 miles away, the Emperor of China, the most powerful man on earth, has decided that his people must now pay their tax in silver.
This sparks a huge demand for silver in China to the point where silver was worth more than gold.
This series explores how the world is transformed when the King of Spain's silver meets the tax demands of the Emperor of China. It's a remarkable story that witnesses how China came to dominate at the dawn of world trade over 400 years ago.
The first time the whole world was linked into one global network, and the most important element of this is silver.
Silver allows China's emperors to become the most powerful men on earth, and silver makes this businessman the richest man in the world.
A lot of America's Industrial Revolution was funded by this Chinese merchant.
Chinese craftsmen go on to create silverware of unparalleled skill and beauty that are coveted across the world.
Already in the 18th century, people were admiring this fantastic work because the wire is so thin, it's like hair.
China's silver trade drives the growth of world cities from Boston to Hong Kong, Shanghai to Seville. But it also sows the seeds of China's near destruction and leads to war with Western powers.
The British were determined to get a war. They got the war.
It's the time when China enters what's become nicknamed the Century of Humiliation, the period when China was not in control of its own external affairs.
But China won't let go its obsession with this precious metal.
Only trust silver. It is almost like a religion in Chinese history. Silver is our gold in Chinese history.
This series reveals how silver changes China's history and the history of the world.
It's like holding a piece of history on your hand.
The skyline of Shanghai is one of the defining views of modern China. It is testament to the last 40 years in which China has undergone a meteoric rise to become the second largest economy on the planet. Soon, it will be #1. But to have China at the very center of world trade is nothing new. 250 years ago, in the 18th century, China is the greatest economic and cultural empire in the world. Ruled over by one of its most celebrated emperors, Qianlu.
Qianlu displayed his wealth. He built palaces. Qianlu was no doubt fully convinced he was one of the wealthiest men living on earth at his time.
China occupies this position of dominance in global trade because all the world loves China's porcelain and silks. And it pays handsomely for these luxury goods in the only commodity that China wants: silver. China has been deeply dependent on silver ever since the 16th century, when the emperor decides to tax his people in silver. But China has little silver of its own, so must import it. This appears to be the perfect combination of supply and demand, particularly at the end of the 18th century, because of a unique commodity China controls, and one that the rest of the world demands above all else.
China had tea. Nowhere else in the world, as it was known at the time, produced tea. Tea takes hold quite rapidly. It's an addictive drug.
Britain imports more tea from China than any other European country. 80% of all tea exports from the port of Canton are shipped to Britain, and the right to import all this tea is held by one remarkable organization, the British East India Company.
They were much more than the name suggests, not just a company, but actually a whole semi-governmental organization in their own right.
By the end of the 18th century, the East India Company boasts a private army of almost 90,000 men, as well as a fleet of heavily gunned warships. It has taken control over a large part of India at the expense of the Mughal emperors. But despite the colossal business in tea, there is a big problem at the heart of all Britain's trade with China.
British merchants needed to try and find goods which would sell. They had cottons, they had wools, they tried everything they could, but it was very difficult to find a good which would significantly take in a Chinese market.
The demand for tea is so great that the British have no choice but to comply with China.
Silver was being essentially leaked out of the coffers of the East India Company as it sought to find products that it could trade successfully with China. So the advantage was essentially with China at that stage.
The East India Company convinces the British government to act. In 1792, Britain launches an enormous trade mission to China. It's a massive undertaking. At its head is the statesman and diplomat Lord George Macartney. Macartney is expected to hammer out better terms of trade with the most powerful nation on earth. The British Library holds the letter from the Home Secretary that spells out the main problem Macartney has to solve.
You should fairly state, after repeating the general assurances of His Majesty's friendly and pacific inclinations towards the Emperor, and his mutual benefits to be derived from a trade between the two nations, in the course of which we receive, besides other articles, to the amount of 20 millions of pounds weight of a Chinese herb.
So instead of paying for all this tea with silver bullion, the British must persuade Emperor Qianlong to buy British goods in return. But British ambitions extend way beyond increased sales. Macartney is told he must convince the Emperor to provide the British with a trading base, a piece of China itself. We wish to obtain a grant of a small tract of ground or detached island. We desire neither fortification nor defense, but only the protection of the Chinese government for our merchants and or their agents in trading or traveling through the country.
They were quite optimistic when they sent this embassy off that they might achieve something of the sort.
There is good reason for British optimism. It is the first nation in the world to industrialize, and as a result, its military and economic power is growing. Britain considers itself an equal to any nation in the world, even China. In September 1792, Lord Macartney, along with 700 soldiers and servants, departs for China on a flotilla of 3 ships.
They sail with interpreters, musicians, they sail with a band. They have a large number of very ornate presents, sing-songs, musical clocks, all sorts of things for the emperor. But they have a clear target in terms of their requests. And at the heart of it, they want the British state to be recognized by the Chinese, a permanent embassy to be allowed to reside at the court in Beijing.
When Lord Macartney arrives in China in July 1793, he's expecting to meet the Emperor, but the Emperor is nowhere to be seen at the Forbidden City. Qianlong has moved his court 200 miles north beyond China's Great Wall to his summer residence at Chengde. After almost a year since he set sail from England, Macartney still must wait before being allowed to meet with the most powerful man on earth.
The Qianlong Emperor has at this point been on the throne for nearly 50 years. He's in his 80s. He is one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history from start to finish. He's been expanding China into Central Asia, tremendously successful wars. So he is extremely proud of his own achievements.
当时马格尔尼他所来的这样一个。 当时是以祝寿的名义给乾隆皇帝80大寿祝寿的名义，所以最初的时候，当乾隆皇帝知道是这样子的时候，觉得是大清帝国威名远播，所以很远的地方的外国人也来向乾隆皇帝祝寿进贡等等。
Macartney is asked to join the queue of ambassadors from the distant borders of Qianlong's vast empire. Qianlong receives tribute from each ambassador in turn. Not in a palace, but in a tent.
我们现在所在的地方叫做万树园，万树园，所以你可以看到它是有很多树在这儿，但是却并没有建筑。所以当时乾隆皇帝接见马格尔尼的时候，也是没有建筑，而是在蒙古包，就像在我背后这样的蒙古包里面接见他的，没有宫殿在这里。
On meeting Qianlong, all ambassadors are expected to kneel and press their head 9 times to the floor. Macartney, however, refuses. So instead of performing the traditional kowtow, he drops on one knee before presenting his gifts.
So this is one of a large set of sketches by William Alexander, who was the junior artist for the embassy. And one of the things he drew was this planetarium, which was the grandest and most spectacular gift, because they had thought from reading the Jesuit missionary accounts of China that the Chinese court was exceptionally interested in astronomy.
But the most significant gift is a solid gold box encrusted with diamonds, containing a letter from the British King George III, laying out his hopes for the trade mission.
所有的前期的准备就为了这一刻，但是据说乾隆皇帝那么看都没有看，就是把这个盒子就放在一边了，因为当时因为双方的目的不一样，那么乾隆皇帝觉得你是来祝寿的，那么你见了我的见到我一眼，那这就是我的一个开恩了，你的目的就已经达到了。
But before McCartney and his retinue are ushered out, Qianlong indulges in some polite conversation that throws the spotlight on the precocious young son of the British vice envoy, who on the long voyage has learned Mandarin.
当时见了乾隆皇帝的时候，乾隆皇帝也问你们中间有谁可以讲中文的吗？然后这个小男孩就被推举出来了，然后乾隆皇帝就让他过来，在乾隆皇帝的身边，然后跟他交流了几句，然后乾隆皇帝觉得很喜欢这个小孩子，并且还把自己身上的一个荷包解下来送给这个小男孩了。
But this charming coda to the embassy has little bearing on the outcome. The letter from George III to Qianlong is translated, and the Chinese emperor's reply is extremely dismissive.
And there's a sentence which is tremendously famous. The productions of our empire are manifold and in great abundance, nor do we stand in the least need of the produce of other countries.
The embassy is a complete and utter failure. The Qing are not ready to accord these Britons the status of equals. The Qianlong Emperor is not just emperor of the Qing Empire, he is the son of heaven. This King George III, who Macartney represents, is in fact, within Qianlong's vision of the world, a subordinate king.
Unfortunately, emperors of Qing dynasty later on became too confident. Qianlong thought, as many great emperors in Chinese history, that he was the king, he was the emperor of the whole world.
Qianlong rejects all of the British requests. Worse still, he issues a stark warning to George III that he will use force if British ships try and trade anywhere other than Canton, the one port in China open to them.
The mission is effectively packed off back to where it came from. It goes back overland, and Qianlong issues instructions that all the way south, Qing military units are to assemble in view of the embassy to impress upon the British that the Qing has great military strength and could deal with them.
So I think everybody who looks at this now realizes that the Qianlong Emperor and his senior advisors, these people were not stupid. They had a very limited knowledge of what was going on in European politics at this time, but they were canny political operators, and that they were aware that the British had a heavily armed warship on the coast, and that they wanted to refuse the unacceptable requests of the British and get rid of them without causing trouble.
Qianlong has maintained the status quo. His show of strength is designed to deter British aggression, and for now, he's come out on top. Macartney returns home empty-handed and belittled. Back in Britain, The public now view China as despotic and backward, and its ruler disparaged and mocked in popular cartoons.
There's a big shift from enthusiastic sinophilia, one might say, intellectually, a love or an interest in China, an appreciation of what seems to be an idealized China, to first-hand reports from Britons who've been there who say, it's nothing like that at all. In fact, as McCartney put it, it's an old first-rate man of war. It's heading for the breaker's yard. And if we can help it along, that will change things.
Despite being stung by Qianlong's rebuttal, Britain has no option but to accept the terms of trade laid down by China. And at the dawn of the 19th century, there are still vast fortunes to be made from China in the most vital trade hub on the planet, Canton. All the tea in China, along with its silks and porcelains, are shipped out of Canton, and into Canton flows the world's silver to pay for these goods.
呢一條嘅珠江嘅航道咧，就係當日中國吸納外面嘅白銀嘅最主要嘅，亦都唯一合法嘅航道。咁所以呢一個咧係個白銀嗰個嘅航道嚟嘅。
Trade with the West makes Canton, this small and remote part of China's massive empire, one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world. This is the golden age of Canton.
It was the nexus of global trade. You have people wearing different costumes, speaking different languages, dealing with goods from all over the world. Of course, some of them are more prominent than others, tea, silver, but it was actually quite a vibrant city that people would flock to because that was where they could pursue their business.
Canton is not only where goods are exchanged, but where they are made. This city becomes a workshop of the world, where thousands of low-paid but highly skilled craftsmen are producing Chinese goods adapted for lucrative foreign markets.
We have to bear in mind that for late 18th century, Europe could not produce its own very fine porcelains, and they have to rely on China. Canton, being the only port which could conduct China trade, also enjoyed the advantage of setting up various manufacturers and workshops for painting these kind of porcelains. I think they will find it very surprised why the foreigners need such a large bowl. We use bowl to eat rice, right, and soup. And they will be told that, oh, this is punch bowl. Well, in terms of shape and function, it must sound very exotic to the Chinese. But in terms of the pictures and also the design and motifs, it must also look very exotic to the Westerners.
Canton is also home to a developing craft that will also take deep root abroad. Thousands of workshops are mass-producing silverware for foreign markets and for foreign tastes.
This is a period of time when virtually no one had a clear sense of what China looked like, and there was tremendous interest, fascination in Cathay, in this land that almost no one had seen. These are not depictions of China per se. They're mythical landscapes with mythical beasts. There are quite a lot of pagodas, boats, beautiful flowers, prunus, this fantastical dragon handle, something that would never be on a piece of London or Philadelphia silver. And that really is proclaiming this as something that was made in China by Chinese silversmiths.
Those Cantonese silversmiths are mass-producing highly crafted silverware, but they're also imitating and undercutting Western silversmiths.
You could have a Chinese silversmith make a spoon that was virtually identical to your familiar 19th century flatware for a fraction of the cost. You can see that these are virtually indistinguishable, both spoons made in the 1830s, and one made in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and one made in Guangzhou, but virtually indistinguishable. The silver itself would have presumably been the same price, but the labor was infinitely less expensive. We think about the mass production of goods in the 21st century and the fact that so many of these things are easily, are so inexpensive, and indeed, to some extent, the same thing is happening in the 21st century as was in the 19th.
Canton is dynamic. It's a hive of industry and commerce. And it's one of the vital crucibles where modern international trade is born. But it presents challenges to Western merchants.
Finding the right commodities to trade, figuring what language to speak, figuring out what currency to trade in, that's all quite no small feat for the early part of the 19th century, when there's no language schools, there was no business school that would tell you how to surmount any cultural barriers. That was the world that I think is even more, in many ways, more fascinating than the world we live in today.
Historic Canton is now buried deep under an immense skyline of concrete and steel. But in the heart of London, this gallery has a series of remarkable paintings that capture how strictly controlled life was in Canton for Western merchants.
So they were restricted to this very small strip of riverside, only about 300 meters long. There wasn't much they could do for exercise. You can see, if you look carefully in this picture, there's 4 little Westerners rowing along. But apart from that, there were the occasional trips to the flower gardens or the temples across the river. Otherwise, they were stuck here.
This small section outside the city walls of Canton becomes known as the 13 Factories.
The buildings don't look particularly Chinese because the Westerners were allowed to adapt certainly the facades and to some extent the interiors to suit themselves. You'll look at the garden on the right-hand side in front of the British factory, and the Cantonese authorities were very suspicious of this garden because it suggested to them that the British were here to stay. A garden means a settlement, possibly the first step towards a colony. So there was a lot of aggravation over that.
There are also heavy restrictions on the social life of the merchants. They are forbidden to learn Chinese, discouraged from mixing with Chinese people, and all women, even wives, are banned.
喺中國嘅朝廷嚟講咧，呢個係好合理嘅，因為咧中國人見到外國人咧已經係覺得係好驚奇，會係有，但係再見埋咧外國嘅婦女喺條街度出現咧，會引起轟動。
Foreign merchants can make their fortune in China, so the heavy restrictions are worth enduring. They make the best of their sometimes tedious lives in what becomes known as the Golden Ghetto.
We know that they drank well and ate well, that insofar as they could, they sampled and enjoyed all of the joys of Chinese leisure life, whether it's brothel boats, high-class brothel boats. They were invited by their merchant friends and collaborators to parties. So in one sense, the merchants had very little to complain about.
Writing of his time in Canton in the 1830s, an American diplomat, Gideon Nye, describes a party that includes one of Canton's most prominent British merchants. Then was seen what had never been seen at Canton before. Mr. Jardine himself and Mr. Wetmore attempting a waltz to a simple Negro melody. But by far the most serious restriction is the Emperor's ruling that these foreign merchants in Canton must conduct their business through a small select group of powerful Chinese merchants known as the Cohong.
If you were a foreign trader in Canton, you couldn't just trade with anybody. You were required by the Qing dynasty to work with one of, 8 to 12 men, the Hong merchants, who were charged with this amazing task of handling the entire international trade of the Chinese empire. Well, of those 10 or 12 merchants, really one separated himself from all the others.
This merchant is one of the most remarkable men in Chinese history. Born in the same year as Napoleon Bonaparte and the Duke of Wellington, this Chinese merchant prospers during a time of great global change and increasing trade to become, it's said, the richest man in the world. His name is Hao Kwa.
Hao Kwa, small frame. This is a guy who doesn't look as rich as he really was. He was an enterprising and daring business person at the port of Canton in the early part of the 19th century. When you have linguistic barriers, he maneuvered the turbulent waters of global finance and global trade in a very careful yet bold manner.
Hao Kwa establishes himself from selling vast quantities of tea to the British, allowing him to amass a fortune in silver that would be valued at more than $1 billion today, said to be greater than the Rothschild family in Europe at that time.
Well, how did they amass such a huge fortune? That was through years of business, primarily with the East India Company, because the return profit was just enormous and it was reliable. It was annual.
Where did the silver go? Well, Hao Kwa had, of course, his vault where he would hold his silver. There's a funny story that during the 1822 fire, as Canton burned down, witnesses identified rivers of silver flowing out of these vaults as all the silver was melting into liquid.
So, instead of letting his money sit idle in a vault, Hao Kwa starts lending money. £10 million to the British East India Company, and then to his fellow Canton merchants.
He didn't feel secure with all his silver sitting in a vault in Canton. He was afraid that at any time, an avaricious official might find a way to take it from him. So he wished to invest his money elsewhere to keep it safe.
He made money with money. So not only was he a success story in the international trade of tea, he was also an instrumental player in the global business of finance as well.
Hao Kwa is also a businessman blessed with foresight. He is aware of the pitfalls of relying too heavily on his one major client, the East India Company. He sees golden opportunity in partnering with merchants from a country that is about to embark on a remarkable rise to power, America.
Well, he looked at the American partners as a way for him to get into the global network beyond his connections with the British.
And a recently independent America is equally keen to forge trade links with China.
Here was a new country, the United States, which measured its length in years, contemplating the oldest country in the world that had multiple dynasties and measured its duration in centuries, even millennia. And so when they journeyed to China, they understood that they were tapping into a vast economic powerhouse.
This is Cape Cod, a wealthy and exclusive enclave on the east coast of America. And in this house, there's a portrait of Hao Kwa, which helps illustrate how some of America's greatest dynasties were founded on the back of the China trade.
He's here because this is a painting that was brought back from Canton by my great-great-grandfather. Warren Delano, too, was a prominent American China trader. He makes a fortune in China. We don't really know the amount, but certainly it would have been at least 100,000 Spanish dollars, probably more.
That's over $20 million in today's money. And it's the money that establishes one of the most significant families in American history. Warren Delano's grandson is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, America's longest-serving president, whose family fortunes are tied to Haokua.
He was held in extremely high regard. He was incredibly honorable. He was punctual in his dealings. He delivered as he wanted. He was nobody's fool. He enjoyed exceptionally close relations with Bostonians, period.
Occasionally in Canton, his American partners got a privileged glimpse inside Haokua's spectacular residence when invited for a rare banquet. Fred Grant's great-great-grandfather Warren and Warren's brother Edward record an astonishing level of hospitality.
Today we dined luxuriously at about 4 o'clock. Our dinner, set out by Haokua, the senior Hong merchant, Chinese style. About 15 courses, bird's nest soup, shark fins, pigeon's eggs. We were 3 hours getting through it. It is many years since Haokua has given a Chinese dinner at his own house, and perhaps never before did he give to a friend the like of this.
With banquets like this, Haokua further strengthens his American bonds. His ties run so deep that he entrusts part of his fortune to be invested on his behalf by his closest business partners in America. His money is invested at a turning point in American history.
You could argue that Haokua helped build America. He invests his money in American railroads and American factories and American coal mines, thus leading to the development of the United States. And so a lot of America's Industrial Revolution was funded by this Chinese merchant who lived in Canton in the early part of the 19th century. Today, there's much fear about Chinese investment. Many Americans wonder if Chinese economic power has too much influence over American companies. Well, what they don't know is that this was happening in a pretty substantial way over 100 years ago, thanks to the China trade.
Despite the wealth it's creating, the Americans encounter the same problem with the China trade as all Western merchants before them. They struggle to find anything the Chinese want to buy.
American traders reluctantly brought silver to China. They would far prefer to have brought commodities. When one brought silver, silver is essentially a currency, and that meant that they weren't really traders so much as wholesalers.
Initially, they tried ginseng. That was good for a season or two. Then efforts were made to bring furs from the Pacific Northwest. That lasted a few more seasons, but what they found over time was that silver was the magic ingredient.
More than ever before, at the beginning of the 19th century, Western merchants desperately need a product to sell to China instead of silver. They do find a product that they are confident will take hold. Like tea, it's plant-based. But what Western merchants are preparing to flood the Chinese market with is a powerfully addictive and illegal drug: opium. It's a shocking decision then, and now, and one that alters the history of the world.
The opium trade has a profound impact on the Chinese economy, on the Chinese government, on Chinese society, and Chinese individuals. It's a winner for foreign traders. It has a devastating impact on Qing China.
Smoking opium has been banned in China since 1813, but the trade not only continues, it increases dramatically. In 1767, 1,000 chests of opium are imported from India. By 1838, it's 40,000.
Might find officials, the highest officials at court, who took a bit of opium to basically relax. You would find middle-class scholars whiling away their time by smoking opium pipes, perhaps in a dedicated opium parlor, or indeed men working in back-breaking labour who would take opium to try and ease the pain in their muscles.
The principal players in this illegal trade are the British, who are cultivating huge amounts of opium in Bengal in India, the jewel in the crown of their growing empire. At last, Britain has a product other than silver that the Chinese crave. But this is not good for China's vital silver reserves.
By the mid-19th century, silver was being drained from China to pay for this incoming opium, and the British were doing very well out of it.
Two ambitious Scotsmen make a killing from selling opium. Their names, still well known for the company they begin in 1832, that grows to become a massive multinational with an annual turnover in excess of $40 billion. William Jardine and James Matheson, who proceed to have a massive impact on this illegal trade in China.
They are influential because of their systematic innovation. So whereas other traders are content to sell in the Pearl River estuary out of sight of Qing officials, Jardine's commissioned ships to be built which will sell the drug along the coast. They commission new clipper ships, fast sailing vessels which will bring the opium as quickly as possible to the China coast.
Jardine and Matheson buy opium in British-controlled Bengal and moor their ships off the Chinese coast. The opium is offloaded and delivered by Chinese middlemen to Chinese customers.
What's most important about Jardine and Matheson is the fact that they do not consider themselves to be smugglers. They are not smugglers. They are gentlemen. They are traders. They are licensed traders. The Chinese who come to buy the opium from their ships in discreet anchorages off the coast of Fujian province, they are smugglers.
But their business invites considerable disdain back in Britain. William Jardine is described by Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, as a dreadful man, a Scotchman, richer than Croesus, one MacDruggy, fresh from Canton, with 1 million of opium in each pocket. But in the minds of Jardine and Matheson, their company is merely supplying a commodity the Chinese crave. And it's a trade that is eyed enviously from the other side of the Atlantic by the Americans. Particularly the China trader, Thomas Sandacid Perkins, one of the most respectable names in Boston society, who resents being frozen out of the lucrative opium trade by the British.
That fact had always bothered Thomas Perkins, who enjoyed a healthy rivalry with his British competitors. If Thomas Perkins could exchange opium for tea, he knew he could become a much, much richer trader than if he were exchanging silver for tea.
The Americans joined this illegal trade when they sourced their own opium through Turkey. The number of opium chests now being smuggled into China grows at an astonishing rate.
There was, of course, a growing social crisis. The use of opium was being noticed by the officials of the Qing dynasty, who were increasingly worried about what they saw as the harmful effects of smoking or chewing opium on large proportions of society.
By the 1830s, the number of opium addicts is counted in millions. The drug is taking a terrible toll on the health of the nation. In Beijing, Emperor Daoguang must confront a huge dilemma. He must stem his people's growing addiction to opium and stop precious silver flowing out of his empire. In March 1839, he reaches a decision. He dispatches his most incorruptible official to Canton, Commissioner Ling Sershu.
Commissioner Lin is appointed to crack down on the illegal opium trade. He moves fairly swiftly, and he moves fairly ruthlessly.
First of all, he would descend on the scene and demand that all opium addicts and all opium dealers immediately surrender their stores of the drug. That was number one. Number two, he was lenient. As long as you complied with his wishes and gave up your opium, he would not penalize you at all. He might even help you get some assistance. However, if you did not surrender your opium, he would put you to death.
Commissioner Lin arrests over 1,500 Chinese dealers and confiscates 70,000 opium pipes. He then demands that the British surrender their chests of opium. When they refuse, he blocks the Pearl River and confines all foreign merchants to their residences.
He holds them under house arrest. Their servants are taken away from them. Some of them have to learn to cook. This is a great shock.
Ling Xiaoshu's focus is not confined to foreign merchants. He holds Canton's chief merchant to account for the rampant opium smuggling.
Ho Kwa, in particular, being the chief home merchant for a long time, was under heavier scrutiny by the Qing court. So there are various rounds of assessment, financially and otherwise, that cost Ho Kwa and his family dearly.
Hao Kwa lives under threat of beheading during this tense standoff. At the same time, one of his American business partners in Canton, Robert Bennett Forbes, reflects candidly on the lucrative nature and the morality of the opium trade in a letter to his wife.
The import of opium has gradually increased under the connaissance of the local authorities until the quantity has amounted to 50,000 chests worth nearly $15 million. It has generally sold readily for cash down. $15 million is a great deal of money, and all at once the government determined to cut off this trade, which has been demoralizing the minds and destroying the bodies and draining the country of money. There has been no moral feeling of indignation connected with the business. I would mention that I made my first fortune by the same.
To bring this impasse to an end and return to business, the British surrender their opium to Ling Xiaoshu. In March 1839, he orders their 20,000 chests of opium to be publicly destroyed.
This is Lin Zexu 硝烟池旧址。那么林则徐当年并不想在府门消化鸦片，他当时把收缴来的鸦片237万多斤鸦片，他想运到北京去。但是北京路途太遥远了，2万多箱鸦片，那么怕路上发生偷漏。那么道光皇帝呢就说你不要运来了，你直接在府门把它消化鸦片算了。然后消化鸦片的时候呢，你让当地的老百姓还有在广州做生意的一些外国人也请过来看。
It is broken down from these cannonball-sized balls of compacted opium paste, mixed with water and poured into the sea. Millions and millions of pounds worth, in today's money, of this precious drug is flushed into the Pearl River.
Lin Zexu was, in a way, a kind, humane man. He realized that vast amounts of narcotics were heading into the water system. He gave a little prayer for the fish and the aquatic life so that they could survive the sudden influx of drugs into their environment.
Then followed up with a letter to Queen Victoria, basically admonishing her for allowing her traders to come to China and sell this particular drug.
So long as you tempt the people of China to buy it, you will be showing yourselves careless of the lives of others, indifferent in your greed for gain to the harm you do to others. Your Majesty must never again allow such a poison to exist in heaven or on earth.
And he had thought, very much in the traditional Confucian way, that having been admonished, this foreign monarch would learn the error of her ways and the opium traders from Britain would stop. It turned out that that was not at all the case.
Instead, after the destruction of their opium, the British demand compensation. When it's refused, It's taken as an insult to the British state. Canton's two biggest opium traders, William Jardine and James Matheson, spearhead a furious response.
They published pamphlets going around the country, speaking to people who could then lobby Parliament. There was a strong belief that a short, sharp shock would solve the China problem and force the Qing to accept the new reality of a world of British power and a world in which the British had to be taken seriously, treated with respect, and allowed to trade.
The British Foreign Minister, Lord Palmerston, needs little persuasion. His rallying cry, "Let us give China a good thrashing and explain ourselves afterwards."
They were determined to get a war. They got the war.
By June 1840, a British flotilla reaches the Pearl River. China is confident it has all its defenses in place.
It was a major operation to get the entire China coast ready for an attack. But they did not realize how fierce the attack would be.
咁呢個嘅威遠炮台咧，興建嘅作用咧就係放一啲嘅大炮去鎮守呢個嘅位置，就防止一啲嘅外國嘅兵船咧係穿越呢條嘅防線，然後進入廣州嘅。呢度有個炮台，咁但係我哋如果睇個炮台咧，佢其實係向前射嘅，嗰啲炮係向前發射嘅。咁呢個嗰邊嘅炮咧就向呢邊，呢度炮向呢邊，咁雙方咧就形成一個交叉火力網。即使咧，如果啲船咧好似由呢度通行，好似而家隻船咁經過啦，當然係由呢個方向行呢邊啦。咁咧佢就會遭受好大嘅攻擊。
But what China has not realized is that Britain in the early 19th century has transformed. No longer the nation that had to kneel before the Chinese emperor to bear gifts, it has emerged triumphant from the Napoleonic Wars and now has imperial ambitions. Despite Britain's population being 30 times smaller than China's, the British government can now raise the same amount of revenue each year as the Chinese emperor.
First of all, it was fueled, literally you might say, because of coal, by the new capacity of the Industrial Revolution. The gunboats that came off the coast of China were very different from the old sorts of sailing vessels you might have had even 100 years earlier. Along with the guns themselves, this was high-level, very high-precision technology. In other words, the British had taken a quantum leap in terms of the amount of violence they were able to inflict on those who ran up against them.
The key battleship, the Nemesis, almost won the Opium War single-handed. Could obviously travel against the wind, being steam-powered, could do all the things that the Chinese war junks couldn't do. It was really a technological mismatch as far as the Chinese were concerned.
China's ports come under relentless attack. Its ships are hopelessly outgunned and outmaneuvered. The British enjoy as much of a technical advantage when the war reaches land.
英國人啦，揸嘅武器啦，已經係用緊個碎發槍，而甚至啦，仲有一個裝置咧，清軍係冇嘅，就係佢哋登陸嘅時候咧，佢哋係裝上刺刀嘅。咁所以咧個好處咧就係佢一路可以開槍，然後近距離嘅時候亦都可以用個刺刀，就好似一支矛咁樣處理。咁根據英國人留低嘅記錄咧，就當日嗰個嘅清軍係打得係好英勇嘅，甚至英國人亦都唔明白點解佢哋唔肯投降，佢哋寧願戰死啊！咁係死傷係好大嘅。
China has lost the war and has no option but to negotiate a peace treaty. In 1842, they signed the Treaty of Nanking. It's a document which reflects how much China's world has changed. The British copy is here in the National Archives in London.
Treaty. Her Majesty the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and His Majesty the Emperor of China, being desirous of putting an end to the misunderstandings and consequent hostilities which have arisen between the two countries, have resolved to conclude a treaty for that purpose. So, although the language of this treaty is warm and friendly, it's in fact a statement that from this point onwards, China is going to have to do what the British say.
The treaty achieves all and more of the British requests of the Macartney Embassy of 1793 that had been so swiftly denied by the Chinese Emperor.
His Majesty the Emperor of China agrees that British subjects, with their families and establishments, shall be allowed to reside for the purpose of carrying on their mercantile pursuits, without molestation or restraint, at the cities and towns of Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai.
But there is an even greater demand from the British.
His Majesty the Emperor of China cedes to Her Majesty the Queen of Great Britain the island of Hong Kong, to be possessed in perpetuity by Her Britannic Majesty, and to be governed by such laws and regulations as Her Majesty the Queen of Great Britain shall see fit to direct. The Emperor of China, who until this point perhaps never really had to cede anything to anyone, is being told that under the influence of gunships, he is going to have to let the Queen of Great Britain, this far-off country, essentially take over, colonize part of his territory, this rather obscure little bit of southern China, an island called Hong Kong. If you could imagine the reverse of this, that a Chinese set of warships had turned up in the late 19th century off the Solent, maybe deciding that they wanted the Isle of Wight, and you have to reverse that thinking to understand how outrageous this would have seemed in China. I think that the Treaty of Nanjing is one of the most important documents in Chinese history because it marks the beginning of a period that shapes Chinese thinking even today in the early 21st century. It's the time when China enters what's become nicknamed the Century of Humiliation. Being forced to sign this treaty, and they were forced, was essentially a sign that China could no longer decide on its own foreign relations. Instead, it could be ordered, it could be told how to relate to the outside world, and the memory of that humiliation has never gone away in China.
China's fall is spectacular. The loss of the war is felt nationally and personally. It brings to an end the golden age of Canton and the rapid demise of its chief merchant and one-time richest man in the world, Hao Kuo. He dies in 1843, 1 year after the end of the Opium War. His son continues the business, but the vast fortune dwindles, and today, only the family name survives.
我们这支呢，是吴秉坚大儿子武元之的儿子，第二个儿子，他过继到给吴秉钧这支。 作为那个不能是这个吴后嘛，所以过继到这边做的。所以我既是吴秉坚的后人，也是吴秉钧的后人。这是武家吴秉坚，这支的武家花园。
Only rare photographs allow a glimpse of Hao Kuo's once magnificent residence and ornamental gardens. Today, almost nothing remains.
这是应该原来留下来的一个通花，这个没动过。原来进来的时候呢。 他们后人在这里住的话，这个基本上就是原貌，是原来的那个留下来的东西。
For the victors, the Opium War is transformative. Hong Kong begins its spectacular rise, from what is dismissed at the time as a barren lump of rock on the Chinese coast to become an integral part of the British Empire. And at the heart of Hong Kong, the business empire of Jardine and Matheson, founded on opium, dominates. In less than 50 years, the silver that helped China dictate world trade has played a profound role in China losing its place as the world's leading economic power. China is now experiencing a harsh new reality. Opium triggers another disastrous war for China, and the country must witness the deliberate destruction of a masterpiece of Chinese civilization.
The destruction of the Summer Palace was very much an act of punishment. It was designed absolutely to humiliate and lower the standing of the Qing court.
China is then overwhelmed not just by Western powers, but also Japan.
You see the gathering together of different imperial powers, all seeking a slice of China.
But worse is to come when China's very existence is threatened.
Many Chinese officials and observers think that, in fact, China faces national extinction. They talk about this, the threat of extinction.
It's here, in a tiny settlement high in the Andes mountain range of South America, that global trade begins. And that's because of what is discovered deep inside this mountain. The purest silver the world has ever seen. It is 1581, and a buyer appears for this silver. 11,000 miles away, the Emperor of China, the most powerful man on earth, has decided that his people must now pay their tax in silver. This series explores how the world is transformed when the King of Spain's silver meets the tax demands of the Emperor of China. It's a remarkable story that witnesses how China came to dominate at the dawn of world trade over 400 years ago.
The first time the whole world was linked into one global network, and the most important element of this is silver.
Silver allows China's emperors to become the most powerful men on earth. It's their demands for silver that are a catalyst for extraordinary wealth across the world.
The impact on the world economy was amazing.
Chinese craftsmen go on to create silverware of unparalleled skill and beauty that are coveted across the world.
Already in the 18th century, people were admiring this fantastic work because the wire is so thin, it's like hair.
China's silver trade drives the growth of some of the world's greatest cities: Boston, Hong Kong, Seville, and Shanghai. But it also sows the seeds of China's near destruction and leads to war with Western powers.
The British were determined to get at war. They got the war.
It's the time when China enters what's become nicknamed the Century of Humiliation, the period when China was not in control of its own external affairs.
But China struggles to let go of its obsession with this precious metal.
Only trust silver. It is almost like a religion in Chinese history. Silver is our gold in Chinese history.
This series reveals how silver changes China's history and the history of the world.
It's like holding a piece of history on your hand.
It is 1842. China is a battlefield. A war is being waged between China and Britain. Its cause? The illegal trade in British opium for Chinese tea. It becomes known as the Opium War. But the root cause of the war is conflict over silver. China needs nothing from the outside world apart from this precious metal. And that's become a major problem for the nations desperate for Chinese products, particularly Britain.
Lots and lots of products being made in China were very popular with people in Britain. Tea is one obvious example, and large amounts of silver was going to have to go back to China to pay for all this. So the British were rather keen to find some other commodity, perhaps rather less scarce than silver, to try and fill that gap. And it turned out that opium, if produced in mass quantities, would fill that gap extremely well.
The illegal trade in opium creates millions of addicts in China and sparks a social crisis. China reacts by seizing and destroying over 1,000 tons of opium.
Millions and millions of pounds worth, in today's money, of this precious drug is flushed into the Pearl River estuary.
China's destruction of British opium is made the trigger for war. China is vanquished and forced to hand over the port of Hong Kong to British control, as well as open 5 more ports to Western merchants.
So China found itself forced by violence to sign treaties which essentially said that foreigners would have significant control from that moment onwards in terms of how China's trade and government would operate.
Hard to believe today, but Hong Kong is dismissed at the time by Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston as a barren piece of rock. However, British merchants see this deep-water port as an invaluable base where they can trade freely without Chinese interference.
This is a Chinese export picture of Hong Kong Island, and it's looking across the harbour, which was really the chief reason why the British wanted to have Hong Kong. The merchants were optimistic. I think they felt that once they could establish themselves beyond the reach of the Chinese authorities, which is what Hong Kong represented, then trade would be unrestricted, and that many of the problems which they'd suffered would go away.
Hong Kong becomes British territory, and they begin to stamp their culture on this former piece of mainland China. The hallmarks of British colonial life become evident throughout the port. In return, many British who now live there become fascinated by all things Chinese, including fine Chinese silverware. Their mementos can still be seen today in London's leading dealers of Chinese export silver.
Everyone wanted to come back from China with the tea set. But in Chinese silver, you could buy a tea set that told a story. Maybe a story of the Three Kingdoms, maybe stories of battles, court scenes. But in Chinese silver, almost everything that's got an inscription, it can be traced back to the original owner, because there are records. These pieces were given as trophies. This goblet, for instance, which was given as a prize in 1850 for a Canton regatta. One of the names mentioned is Augustine Hurd Jr. He was the nephew of somebody who was in partnership, actually in an opium business.
The loss of the Opium War and loss of sovereignty are a major shock to the Chinese. But there is also a sense that the war has also been driven by a profound clash of worldviews.
On the one hand, you had the view of what you might call the traditional Chinese court, the idea that China was at the center of the universe of ethics and behavior, and that foreigners coming to China would have to adapt to the norms of China itself. On the other hand, you have another very important force, the rising force of British capitalism and imperialism. Britain was becoming this big, outward-looking, buccaneering nation that was looking for new markets. And China, with of course its millions and millions of inhabitants and its unopened markets, became a place where it wanted to trade.
But in the wake of the war, sales of British goods in China remain poor. The British see no fault in their Yorkshire woolens and Sheffield cutlery, and lay the blame squarely with Chinese obstruction. They want even more ports opened and even fewer restrictions.
They have 5 ports, but why not 7? Why not 10? They have ports along the coast and to Shanghai, but what about the Yangtze River? How can they get closer to the markets? What about Wuhan, Hankou, along the Yangtze River? What about the north? Why should they still suffer restriction?
The British look for an excuse to bring back their gunships to China and press their claims. In 1856, they find one in Canton when Chinese officials board a British cargo ship and accuse the crew of being pirates.
他的船在广州啊，这个黄埔贸易的时候呢，被缉事官员啊来检查，把英国的国旗啊悬挂在这个船上的英国国旗啊扯下来了。当时的英国的这个公使啊，巴夏里呀，觉得是对于英国的一种侮辱，他就是以鸭螺号事件为借口，向中国发起了第2次战争。
This time, it's not just the British fighting the Chinese. Other Western powers see an opportunity for gain and join the assault on China.
You see the gathering together of different imperial powers all seeking a slice of China. So if the British come in, the French also come in too because they want to get more territory. The Russians, who are beginning to expand their empire, feel they can't be left out. And this means that during that time, you might say that the Second Opium War marks the moving into high gear of the European and Western powers in terms of trying to conquer parts of China.
When a joint Anglo-French force captures Beijing in 1860, it commits a shocking act of cultural vandalism. They first loot, then set alight the Emperor's Summer Palace, a magnificent complex of buildings full of priceless artifacts. It takes 3,500 British troops to set the entire palace ablaze, and the massive fire lasts for 3 days. The palace is destroyed by order of the commander of the British military force, Lord Elgin.
The destruction of the Summer Palace was very much an act of punishment. It was designed absolutely to humiliate and lower the standing of the Qing court at the time. Lord Elgin thought quite carefully about what gesture it was that they wanted to make. And in this particular case, they thought that something that really showed the Chinese elite, the court, that the civilization which they had built up so carefully and so thoughtfully could be destroyed so quickly would be a salutary lesson.
China is also forced to pay war damages to the British with the very silver they've been determined to import. 10 million silver taels in war damages, in addition to 21 million silver dollars from the First Opium War, more than half of China's annual revenue. The treaties China is forced to sign fully legalize the opium trade, as well as opening 11 more ports to foreign trade, allowing merchants access deep into the country's interior. The British National Archives in London hold copies of the key peace treaties, but it also holds a letter from the younger brother of the Emperor, Prince Kung, to Lord Elgin, which mournfully acknowledges Chinese defeat.
This essentially is a letter which you might almost say is the opening up of China to the wider Western world. I do wonder how Prince Kung, as a noble and high official of the Qing dynasty, must have felt authorizing this letter. He was sending it not just to anyone, but to Lord Elgin, the British official who represented a country which had essentially brought China to a position of submission, and along the way had of course destroyed the Summer Palace. I think Prince Kung would have sent this letter out with a pretty heavy heart.
Prince Kung is just 27 when he's thrust into the negotiations with the British. He is high-born and influential, but new to this world of international diplomacy.
Prince Kung was a very interesting guy. He was considered the most westernized and enlightened Manchurian royal in his age. The first time the Westerners, the British, saw him, on his right hand, it was a glass of cognac. On his left-hand side was a cigar.
Prince Gung knows his country is close to collapse. Foreign troops are in Beijing, and China is in a bloody revolt. It has never been so vulnerable.
The truth was cruel. China lost. And China had to play a catch-up game for the whole 20th century.
Prince Gung sets about a mission to transform China from victim to victor. It is called the self-strengthening movement.
洋务运动的背景当然是中国在面对西方的和西方发生冲突的时候，那中国人就会觉得这是数千年未有之变局，就会在思考我们究竟输在什么方面。那他们其中的一种想法就觉得可能输在技术方面。那我们洋务运动的一个本质思想其实之一就是说，我们去学习西方的技术，然后就可以赶超他们。
Although sophisticated in terms of its high culture and its artisan crafts, China, in the middle of the 19th century, must make up vast ground lost to its industrial rivals.
China lagged behind in steam power, talking in terms of the Industrial Revolution. We had no idea that a steam engine ran on steam. If you think about it, you haven't seen how a steamboat works. How do you know it ran on steam? You thought it ran on fire, which was exactly what they did.
Prince Gung immediately focuses on modernizing China's defenses that were so easily crushed during the Opium Wars.
We have the creation of a new armed division, which are armed with Western weapons. You have the building of naval dockyards. There are moves towards establishing mines, as well as bringing steam vessels to replace old Chinese sailing junks. So all this is happening actually quite quickly and quite successfully.
Gung and his self-strengthening movement need silver to finance their reforms. Taxing China's foreign trade will supply him with vital funds. That leads him to one extraordinary institution.
The Imperial Maritime Customs Service was one of the oddest but most interesting organizations to exist in China through the mid-19th to mid-20th century. It served the Chinese government, bringing in tax revenue from tariffs, goods charged on goods being imported into China. But it wasn't run by the Chinese, it was run by the British throughout almost all of that time.
The British introduce a system of uniform custom tariffs for the first time in Chinese history, which has immediate benefits for international trade.
The Maritime Customs provided China with a very standard and national service. What does that mean? So any foreign merchant can ship their products to Shanghai or any other custom house, and they could speak English to talk to the local officials, to local commissioners. So there was a very reliable tariff protocol and a totally modern harbor management for them to do their business.
Then in 1863, it is Prince Gung who makes the Maritime Customs Service's most significant appointment, a man that shares his ambitions to modernize China. His name is Robert Hart, a brilliant young Irishman who has been in China working as an interpreter and diplomat since 1854. Hart has quickly formed a deep empathy for China that becomes a feature throughout the 77 volumes of his diaries that he keeps faithfully for 40 years. They are now kept in Queen's University, Belfast.
I am on the Chinese side, and I will help them to the best of my abilities. And I don't care who knows what I do or what I say. But I think that sympathy he had for China that comes through his diaries so very clearly.
He loved to learn Chinese. That's one very important thing. And then he forced all his subordinates to learn Chinese as well. He was interested in all sorts of different topics of Chinese medicine, music, arts, all sorts of things.
In heart, Prince Gung has now added a vital foreign partner to his circle of modernizers, all of them determined to re-strengthen China.
Prince Dong called him our heart, means Prince Dong saw him as a real friend.
For Prince Gung, the maritime customs under Heart is providing far more than just revenue.
It would create a translator's college, which was really meant as the office that would train China's diplomats. It would also light China's coast, all the lighthouses, all this facilitating of navigation. It had a huge role in that. It would build about 26 custom houses. And my two favorite ones are the one in Urumqi, which is really in Central Asia, and it must be the maritime custom house furthest away from any bit of sea anywhere in the world. And the other one is the Yadong custom house, which is in Tibet, which again must be the custom house highest in the world, and again very far away. And for the Qing dynasty, by having these custom houses in Urumqi and in Tibet, these were markers of Qing territory. How clever. It would end up collecting about 30, 40, 50% of taxes available to the Chinese state. Huge significance.
Under Hart's stewardship, the maritime customs revenue increases from 8 million silver taels in 1865 to over 14 million taels 20 years later. Well over $1 billion in today's money. By 1893, maritime customs are providing a fifth of government income.
It became the biggest, maybe the most important financial pillar of the Chinese government, because it was it has very, very little corruption, much more efficient and effective.
Foreign trade increases through the recently opened treaty ports and exports surge. Silver flows into China once more. But China, with its dependence on silver, is falling out of sync with the global economy. After massive discoveries in America and in Australia, most of the world's leading nations have left silver behind and are now basing their economies on gold.
Chinese adherence to silver standard for a long time was considered something of a backward phenomenon. Any country that was respectable should join the gold standard. China was very backward, was so disorganized, it was not able to join the gold standard.
But the very idea of reform itself is challenged within the imperial court by a deeply conservative, ruthless, and powerful woman. A woman who effectively runs China in the last decades of the 19th century through her influence over the boy emperor, Guangxu.
The Dowager Empress Cixi is one of the most intriguing characters in modern Chinese history. She was literally a power behind the throne. She believed in the restoration of a very strong imperial rule, and she persecuted and even had executed some of the most important reformers in late 19th century China, who argued that actually China really needed to rethink, rework its system of government to cope with the modern world. She also had had a lot of money spent on the redecoration of the imperial palace, which some people argued could have been spent in a different way, instead for the fortification of the Chinese armed and naval forces.
Empress Cixi's dominance at court and her resistance to Prince Gung is undermining China's fledgling reforms. Just across the East China Sea, another empire is under threat from the West, but Japan's response could not be more different to China's.
Rather than trying to make do and mend, Japan actually overthrew its ruling class and instead undertook one of the fastest and most complete modernizations ever in history. The Japanese modernized their law, their army, their constitution, their education system, all within about 20 years or so, and as a result became a powerful imperialist power in its own right, and quickly would become every bit as rapacious, as greedy as the Western powers in terms of seeking rights and territory in China itself.
War breaks out in 1895. China's much-heralded new navy is outgunned and outsmarted by the Japanese. All of China is appalled to lose so easily to their once weak and subordinate neighbor. China loses even more territory as it is forced to cede control over Korea and Taiwan to Japan. But it must also pay war damages of 200 million taels of silver, almost 4 times the annual revenue of Japan itself. This is an enormous boost to Japan, who suddenly have the financial reserves to join the leading nations of the world and base their economy on gold. It is utter humiliation for China.
This amount of money that the Chinese government has to pay to the foreign powers is a substantial part of its budget. Enormous indemnities of the sort that one can never pay off from the Chinese government.
In order to pay its mounting war debts, China must borrow massive amounts of money. But its financial institutions are not able to meet the huge sums required.
The Chinese did not evolve the kind of formal banking arrangements that you had in Europe. Chinese emperors did not think of owing debts. If they demanded it, you paid it. So they don't owe you a debt. So there's no such thing as a public debt in China. And if you didn't have public debts, you didn't have powerful banks. So Chinese banking was always weak.
In raising enough funds to pay for its war debts, China helps fuel the rise to power of foreign banks.
I would definitely say after 1895, the foreign banks' power came into China. The easiest reason was that because the Chinese government had to borrow money for its indemnities to Japan. So the Chinese government told to HSBC and Deutsche Bank to borrow enough money to pay back to Japan. Then the HSBC became very important because every year the Chinese government had to pay back to the HSBC.
Increasing foreign influence over China is fueling more than just anger across China. It fuels rebellion. Just 2 years after the war with Japan, China erupts in revolt. An anti-Western movement that began in northern China is spreading like wildfire. The rebels call themselves the Boxers.
They call themselves boxers because of the martial arts they train with. They believe themselves to be invulnerable to foreign bullets, who believe that the world has been turned upside down by the eruption into China of foreign ideas and foreign things and foreign buildings.
The Boxers' slogan is "Revive the Qing, destroy the foreign," and it's a sentiment that finds sympathy in the imperial court. In June 1900, the Dowager Empress takes a decision that will result in the near destruction of the Chinese Empire.
This was a sort of anti-foreign feeling that in some ways spread through all levels of society. Cixi reflected that in many ways. For much of her life, she was someone who was very skeptical, indeed hostile, about the foreign presence in China.
Seizing the chance to drive all Westerners from China, in 1900, Cixi comes out in support of the Boxers and declares war on all foreign powers. But in less than 2 months, a military alliance that includes British, French, German, American, and Japanese forces reaches occupied Beijing and crushes the Boxer rebellion. Piled on top of its previous war damages with Japan, China is immediately ordered to pay a colossal and punitive 450 million silver teals, 1 teal for each of China's 450 million people, equivalent to $300 billion today. The Qing treasuries contain nothing like this amount. China now has to face the gravest threat in its 2,000-year history.
Many Chinese officials and observers think that, in fact, China faces national extinction. They talk about this, the threat of extinction. They know that the British had conquered India. They fear the same will happen in China.
During the tense negotiations, the Chinese are keenly aware of what is at stake for their country.
China could not risk her international reputation again, because China had to rebuild her international image as a trustworthy friend to the foreign states.
Behind the scenes, the Chinese turn to one man, a Westerner, ironically, who has the insight into foreign affairs and finance that can help rescue China from being carved up.
First of all, Robert Hart tried to convince the foreign powers that never ever try to separate China into several pieces, because China should be refunctional in order to pay up her debt. No one wanted to kill that opportunity to get more money from China.
Robert Hart is able to bring all these people together, and he very cleverly said, yes, okay, we're going to pay this huge indemnity, 450 million ounces of silver, but we do it, it is structured as a single bond between the Qing dynasty and all the 8 nations that had invaded China. So the interests of those 8 nations are focused on that one bond and on the Qing dynasty paying.
China has avoided partition, but almost all the revenues of the Chinese state are placed under foreign control to pay the war reparations. The Boxer indemnity is a devastating burden. China has no choice but to borrow again from foreign banks. Debt piles on debt. The Chinese government hands responsibility for this huge operation to the organization run by Robert Hart.
The Chinese government wanted to be as simple as possible, so they decided to delegate that to the Maritime Customs Service. And it was rather easier because the Customs Service imposed the tariff tax and stored the money to HSBC.
China has been reduced from an economic superpower to subordinate in less than a century.
I think by the 1850s, 1860s, China's GDP was still about 30% of world GDP, and by the end of the century, it's 6%. So it's an absolute decline, really. It's an absolute decline also in living standards.
From once sitting at the peak of world trade, China is now struggling to function as a state, and its institutions are chronically weak. Desperate last-gasp attempts to modernize fail in the face of rising discontent. China's people begin to lose faith in their rulers, and in 1911, the emperor is overthrown by revolutionaries led by Sun Yat-sen. The silver that helped make China the richest nation in the world is also responsible for bringing 2 dynasties to its knees. The fall of the Qing dynasty and the fall of the Ming dynasty 250 years before it can both be traced back to the kingdom's complex relationship with this white metal.
我就觉得白银在中国和中国历史其实是有个纠缠的，就很多朝代的兴起是因为白银，但很多朝代的覆灭也是和白银有关系。
Silver continues to be a problem in the turmoil that follows the revolution. Warlords take control of individual provinces and civil war breaks out. Taxation paid in silver, the lifeblood of China's economy, cannot be collected. China can barely function.
Each warlord
controls one or several provinces. And you can imagine that when warlords control provinces, they issue their own silver as a way to memorize the warlords, right? Like George Washington in the US quarter, right? So same way, so there are different kinds of silver coins. So it was very confusing because people have to recognize whether these silver coins were real or not, were authentic or not.
China's silver currency is becoming even more chaotic. But there is one city on the Chinese coast that is a beacon of economic stability.
Shanghai, storied seaport of the fabled Orient, commercial metropolis of China, and one of the world's greatest seaports.
上海在19世纪的40年代，就已经对海外开放了。他西方人可以在上海合法的居住、经商的这样一个城市。
Shanghai was a trading city. It's existed for many hundreds of years, but until the British presence, it didn't become the entrepot, the big cosmopolitan melting pot of trade and commerce that it is today. You've got a boulevard, a thoroughfare. So there today, it's called Nanjing Road, and along it there were shops, businesses, there were a whole variety of things that said that this city is not Washington, it's New York. In other words, it's a place where people come to do business and to trade.
In the 1920s, Shanghai becomes China's wealthiest port, and this international trade is good for the Maritime Customs Service, which during this time of conflict accounts for nearly 90% of government revenue. And all this government revenue in silver is deposited in a British-owned foreign bank, some of whose founders have grown rich from the opium trade, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC.
Every penny of the custom revenue was stored in the HSBC after 1911. So HSBC had an extremely big, vast cash flow. That was basically the reason why it could become the biggest bank in the Far East in the 20th century.
This allows the bank to build lavish new headquarters on the Bund, Shanghai's famous waterfront. The elegance and grandeur of its interior is described as unsurpassed by any financial or commercial house in Asia and the Far East from Suez to the Bering Sea.
China's demand for goods from abroad grows in leaps and bounds as imports exceed $300 million a year. There is movement everywhere, no standing still.
In the 1920s, Shanghai is one of the biggest cities in the world.
Here is the Occidental quality of Shanghai with its skyscrapers, trolley cars, and semi-foreign atmosphere.
Shanghai is known as the Paris of the East, and the Chinese embrace the spirit of the age. The silversmiths of Shanghai are producing silver cocktail shakers in bulk.
All the elite Chinese went to these fabulous cabarets and nightclubs and ballrooms. And this neighborhood was really the epicenter of that jazz age nightlife in the city in the 1920s and 30s. So you can just imagine that at night, this neighborhood was this fantastic wonderland of neon lights ablaze and jazz music blaring from these ballrooms and nightclubs.
There is one significant reason why Shanghai can thrive beyond the chaos of post-revolutionary China. It is a Chinese city that is under foreign control. It is also deeply divided, made up of separate zones for foreigners called the International Settlement and the French Concession. All of the 35,000 Europeans who lead a privileged life in prosperous Shanghai are exempt from the laws of China.
Western residents will only observe Western law, which means they won't, in what's still Chinese territory, practice Western legal system and legal rules. And those things all, in the end, have enormous consequence on the China as a whole.
One of those enormous consequences is that business in Shanghai, foreign and Chinese, is conducted according to Western laws, and that provides Shanghai with the stability to become the biggest holder of silver in China.
Shanghai was unique. It was certainly it was expanding much more quickly than Hong Kong. It had a population several times larger. And Shanghai was also become, to a certain degree, after the 20th century, the haven of Chinese business and industry and banking.
But even within booming Shanghai, China's currency remains a problem. Nothing exemplifies this more than its adherence to antiquated silver ingots.
When you have a piece of silver ingots, what do you do when you carry it into the market? You have to literally weigh them, measure them, test them, whether they are genuine silver or not. They are not currencies by count. You cannot count them. You have to measure them.
The system of weighing and assessing the quality of silver and measuring it in taels not only stretches back to medieval times, but it's also far from uniform. Across China, there are as many as 170 different measures of tael.
大家都认识到，银两和银元同时存在，它这种反复的计算、反复的兑换，这个成本实在是太浪费、太不方便，没有理由再坚持下去。
But change in China in the 1930s does not come easily. Just as Prince Gung had tried before him, one man emerges who has the vision and determination to try and reform his country's archaic institutions, in particular, China's centuries-old silver currency. His name is TV Soong.
宋子文他是哈佛毕业嘛，是一个比较西式的人，然后他做事呢，就说也是一个比较西化的人，这就是其实是他是算是一个新式的银行家。
TV Soong stands at the peak of Shanghai society. He is from the most famous family in Republican China. His sisters are all society beauties, and his brother-in-law is China's leader.
当然，宋子文他有很大的一个抱负，希望要改造中国，改变中国，尤其是在财政制度、预算制度、银行制度、货币制度等这些方面。
As finance minister to the new republic, in April 1933, he calls a meeting at the Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, in which he sets out to radically alter China's currency. Soong's daring proposal is to abolish the silver tael, the unit of Chinese currency which has been used for centuries, and replace it with one standard minted silver coin. But he has a formidable obstacle to overcome. Set against TV Soong's reforming zeal are the native bankers who meet here every day at their power base, the inner garden by the city god temple in the heart of old Shanghai.
钱庄在上海已经有那么大的影响力，可以在一个繁华的地带，然后有这么一个公共集合的地点，这其实是可以看出当时商人自治的一些特点。
The native banks profit directly from China's complex and inefficient currency.
他们的业务计算模式其实和银两有关，此外也是利益，因为他们很多业务就是被银两有关的业务，其实是被钱庄垄断的。
银元和银两兑换的比例是由他规定的，并且要到他那里去兑换，他都要收手续费。
Despite the opposition of the native banks, TV Soong has the full support of China's modern and foreign banks. On the 5th of April 1933, the silver tael is abolished and becomes an instant and now illegal relic of the past. The new silver dollar is issued featuring Sun Yat-sen, China's first president, and on the reverse is a sailing boat, a symbol of centuries of trade and prosperity.
废两改元非常重要，那它其实就彻底的使得中国的白银从那个一个称量货币变成一个有统一的一个币制，变成由银两走向了银元，所以这是一个非常重要的过程。
The reforms of TV Soong are celebrated across the world. He makes the cover of Fortune and Time magazines. He is pronounced a financial genius, comparable to Alexander Hamilton, the man behind the creation of America's first national bank. He's even invited to address the American nation in a radio broadcast on NBC. During the broadcast, he stresses the special relationship between America and China.
Some of your most distinguished families were engaged in the China trade. Millions of dollars changed hands without one word being put down in writing. It was a superb example of trust and mutual respect.
TV Soong has achieved one of the great reforms in China's history. At long last, the country has a simple, unified silver currency.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange in market prices.
But almost immediately, a global financial crisis will finally bring an end to China's entanglement with silver, the Great Depression. But surprisingly, during this profound shock to global capitalism, China's use of silver initially gives the country an unexpected benefit.
The world was in recession in the early 1930s because of the stock market crash of 1929, right? And also Germany was in trouble, right? Because of it, China was effectively, under nationalist government, was using one currency, which is silver, which was losing value against most other currencies. So Chinese money was cheap. Other people's money was expensive. So Chinese goods appeared to be cheap because Chinese goods were denominated in silver partially, right? So Chinese goods became cheap. Therefore, China was able to export to foreign countries with relative ease.
But this advantage does not last long. China is about to suffer at the hands of the very country that just 2 years previously had been applauding the financial reforms of TV Soong. An American senator, Key Pittman, demands action. The silver-producing states, including his own state of Nevada, are suffering because the global price of silver is so low. The president bows to pressure and enacts the Silver Purchase Act, which results in America going on a silver buying spree.
The Silver Purchase Act in the U.S., which was largely driven by small mining states, a few mining states in the U.S., ended up driving up the global prices for silver.
With the price of silver rising because of American demand, there is now an unstoppable flow of silver out of China. It's a catastrophe. Banks go under, businesses are starved of loans, industry and agriculture suffer a collapse in prices. The financial crisis becomes an economic crisis and then a social crisis.
So the Chinese government is forced to entertain the idea of a major currency reform and to remove this dependence on silver.
Unable to control its currency, China is forced now, finally after centuries, to abandon silver.
US was forcing China to say, you don't use silver. The US was telling China, get off silver.
And in 1935, they do exactly that. They throw in the towel and take China off the silver standard.
Silver comes to an end. The silver story in China really comes to an end in very abrupt fashion.
1935 marks the end of 6 centuries of silver currency in China, and before long, silver artifacts will disappear as well. When the communists take control of China in 1949, silver is a distant memory. That is, until a chance discovery 20 years later in this mansion on America's East Coast. It was once the home of Robert Bennett Forbes, a prominent 19th century China trader who built his fine house with the profits he made from buying and selling tea and opium. His great-grandson, H.A. Crosby Forbes, develops a keen interest in the family silver when he inherits the house.
Crosby was interested in so many different things, but certainly one of his greatest passions was the subject of Chinese export silver. This was a subject that really had been primarily forgotten in the 20th century. Crosby really began looking at this subject critically decades before almost anyone else did.
In 1975, Crosby Forbes publishes Chinese Export Silver. It is the first scholarly work on the subject. The study of one silver artifact illustrates how neglected this unique Chinese craft has become.
This is an extraordinary teapot in England, but by the 19th century, it had been completely forgotten that this was made in China. It was a celebrated piece of English silver, published widely in books on Old English silver, and indeed, even in the 19th century, this served as a model for silversmiths who were becoming masters. And Crosby really was the one who first re-identified this as being Chinese rather than English.
Today, more than 40 years after Crosby Forbes' work shed light on an exquisite but forgotten Chinese craft, export silver is now returning to modern China. It's a window into the past and is a force for creativity in China today. Alan Chan is an artist and one of Hong Kong's leading designers.
I collected because I find a certain kind of beauty that is beyond comparison, because I think this export silver carry a bit of cultural history. This has been used as an eyeglass case. So the entire composition inspired me as a graphic designer. I think the way the bamboo leaves go together with the calligraphy, this could be a cover design for a book, this could be inspiration for a manual cover. This is wonderful. It's amazing because this is a sort of pepper set, you know. You put a condiment here, you can put your toothpicks here. It's a beautiful conversation piece to put on top while you're having dinner, you know. They used this as a business card holder over 100 years ago. So that means they're already using business card over 100 years ago in China. I find it always hard to believe how on earth they can come up with such an intricate design and also craftsmanship. You see different kind of costume, how people would dress over 100 years ago. This is like a 3D movie showing you the story of a typical courtyard house, how people live and how their everyday lifestyle could be, you know. Chinese mirror don't usually come in with a handle like this. And to incorporate a dragon into such a European shape, you look at it. The tail start from here and move around the circle and they end up like here. I think this is just beautiful. I look at this mirror, I would say, wow, who was the beauty in front of the mirror other than me 100 years ago?
In past centuries, silver demonstrated China's economic might, and it still does today in the country's highest diplomatic courts. In 2014, when China plays host to the leaders of the Asian and Pacific world, it gives each one an exquisite silver gift that spoke not only to craftsmanship, but also an acknowledgement of China's historic relationship with silver. Today, China is once more the biggest importer of silver in the world. The industries producing the goods that help power our globalized world, consumer electronics, mobile phones, electric cars, all need silver. And they are produced here in China on an enormous scale. These workers are preparing to start the early shift at one of the biggest factories in China. They are part of a 1,200-strong workforce who help harness the power of the sun with silver. 70 million of these solar batteries are produced each month and inside every 6-by-6-inch panel, there is a film less than the width of a human hair of silver.
那么1个月大约会用到白银是7吨的量。因为这个银呢，它具有良好的这种导电性，还有稳定性，所以呢，它是太阳电池，特别是晶体硅太阳电池中首选的这种电极材料。它呢，主要是在生产过程当中，我们采用是丝网印刷的这种技术，使银浆料那么先在电池片的表面形成这种山线性结构，然后经过烘干还有退火之后形成银电极。银电极呢可以将电池片它发出来的这种电荷收集起来，就可以导出。所以说它在电池片当中是重要的这么一种材料。太阳发电是我们现在目前正在建设的这种安全的、这种高效的、这种现在可持续发展的这种现代能源体系的重要的一部分。太阳发电是非常重要的，不光对于中国重要，对于世界，对于我们整个人类的发展都非常的重要。
The largest solar energy farms in the world are in China. They consume the world's silver to help power the country's relentless industries, whose output seems to be unstoppable, but in constant need of new markets.
The Chinese economy now is already the largest in terms of its production of real goods. Goods you can touch, like clothing, like cameras, like TV sets, right? It is already 27% bigger than the US economy in terms of producing real goods. In this regard, the Chinese economy is no different from the British economy in the early days, in the early 19th century, right? So the Chinese businesses would want to expand.
The skylines of modern China testify to its economic dominance and its seemingly endless potential. But modern China allows the world to once again see what this country has always been.
For most of human history, China has represented the world's foremost economic power. Really, if you look at it, China had just napped for a little bit in the 19th century. There's Napoleon's very famous phrase, when China, awakens, the world will tremble.
China heralded globalization by throwing in its lot with silver in 1581. It triggered a new epoch in world history with its need for this precious metal. Today, money has many forms, and most transactions are electronic. But in the Chinese language, the character for money says silver, and the characters for bank says silver shop. Pointed reminders of how central silver was for centuries in shaping China's economy and how it shaped the rest of the world.
也许我们今天不再用白银，但是和白银有关的记忆、教训，其实都还在我们生活当中、生活周围，只是看不见而已。所以我觉得，如果谁违背了这一点，不能从白银的故事中吸取教训的话，谁都会付出代价。